Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Hypnotic. So, here's the thing about this movie. Really, we have the kind of easy way out that is to be presented for this movie, where, like, instead of coming up with a really complex story, because Netflix doesn't really do that kind of thing anymore, they kind of go on and just kind of, like, give you a story where it's the easiest thing, but has the kind of the most interesting cast. So you're just like, you know what? I'm just gonna enjoy the ride of this movie, and like eventually see where all this plays out. So, like, I would say that of course this movie right out of the gate, this is like an okay film. Go ahead and check it out. Um, and it's like an interesting enough film to keep your interest, especially if it's about an hour and 29 minutes. Go ahead and check it out, anyways, because it's an easy film. It's not like a 3 hour film or a 2 hour film where they like really have to just stretch everything out and just like. And some people may even feel like this movie does stretch things out, but anyways, so some people may have their own opinions about this film. Some people might like this film, or some people may hate it, or some people may, like me, feel in the middle of the road of this film, where really it's just like they couldn't have come up with a more like they couldn't have come up with a seemingly like different kind of spin of this. Like, but I guess it's whatever, right? Like, I guess you really just have had to have, like, you should have gone into this movie completely blind, not even looking at the title, and basically knew how this movie was going to play out. Because that's how, like, Netflix really is. They kind of go with the easy themes and whatever. So, going into this film, teeing it up, what is this movie, of course, about? So, we can just easily say for this movie that we end up having a therapist that is to be far too nice for a reason, uh, to eventually have a certain person who is to just be like, well, you know what, like, how would I go and maybe I might need some therapy. Maybe I need some kind of adjustments in my life. And so Jen goes out of her way to eventually meet this therapist, eventually take on a session, and then eventually takes on a lot more to eventually have seemingly this therapist taking control of Jen's life and eventually taking control of seemingly everything. To where it's just like, hey, Jen, how about you just go and just take a good old sleep right now? Um, Kind of controlling this person. And so there was something about it where eventually we had Detective Wade Hollins. And if I hadn't said this already, like a really good cast, a really enjoyable cast. I really like this movie because of the cast, because of how everyone is to kind of deliver all this stuff. Because there are people that are just kind of really at their A game of how they're to like present this movie. So we have kind of this detective character who is to eventually start to easily and quickly figure out Collins or Dr. Collins' Mead out, and is to eventually just be like, you know what? Like I'm a person that loves puzzles, and so I started to figure out your pattern, your puzzle, your whatever, and so I think that you are probably a killer, sir. And so, like, we end up having this cat and mouse this whole entire rest of the movie where Colin is trying to do what he's trying to do, and Jen is trying to figure out a way around it, and the detective is trying to pin this guy on murders, and Collins is trying to figure out a way to get at this detective. And so there's a whole kind of slew of things going on. It's a really interesting film. or just interesting enough. It's okay enough. It's good enough, I guess. So, but I wouldn't say this is a good film. I would just say that it's an okay film. Check it out. So let's just go into this. Let's go into spoilers, because like I'm kind of really just at this point, because I should have went to bed like 4 hours ago. So like this is what you get. So with that said, it's about that customary time yet again to go into spoilers about this movie. So it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So beginning of the film, we have a woman desperately calling this detective, mentioning that like, excuse me, but I feel like I'm getting just uh, this chill in the back of my spine, seemingly thinking that there's to be a man that is gonna that is after me, that is stalking me. I'm not quite sure, but so all of a sudden this girl is to go off into this elevator and going to leave for the night because she feels she's being followed, she's being stalked, she's being watched. So this girl eventually goes into this elevator, and all of a sudden she ends up going and is to answer this unknown call. So this girl answers this unknown call to eventually have this catchphrase of "Your world is going to end." So, or this is how your world is going to end. So all of a sudden, this girl hangs up this phone and is to all of a sudden see that the sides of this elevator is starting to close in on her, and all of a sudden she is starting to have this seemingly crushing sensation going into her body, and all of a sudden we end up finding her supposedly dead. We end up finding later on a camera that actually the walls weren't coming in on this woman. She was just having this hypnotic panic attack of sorts, which led into, I guess, a heart attack because of pure fear. And so eventually, like, we end up seeing that this thing isn't all that true. But it's kind of an interesting imagery that we start this film with. So cue us in on this girl named Jen, who it seems that she had just come off this relationship. It seems like she's kind of between things right now, and so really we just have Jen's friend who's to tell Jen, it's like, hey, you know what? Like, how about you come to this party? I'm sure you could really use it, and so eventually you might meet some people there and have fun and whatever. And so Jen is like, well, yeah, I guess I can go to this party. Like, so eventually she ends up going and re-meeting back up with her ex at this party, and of course her friend's boyfriend is to just mention, it's like, well, hey, like, we didn't plan for him to be here and you to be here. Like, you said that you were coming at the last minute, and we already had planned him to come to this party, so it's just a sticky wicket situation. So eventually, at some point, Jen is to go and seemingly be at the same table with her ex boyfriend, or eventually she is to notice that all of a sudden he is to almost eat something that he's allergic to. Jen saves this guy's life, and so all of a sudden we have Scott who's to mention, oh, thank God that you didn't eat that food. It would have sucked for you to have, or it would have sucked for us to have your dead body christen our new apartment or a new house or whichever. And so he's like, well, hey, that's great that all you can think of is that instead of my life. So we end up having seemingly Colin Mead, or Dr. Colin Mead, kind of consistently interjecting and is to just kind of get to know Jen, and eventually at some point is to go and ask Jen like what she's kind of doing right now for her job, and she used to just kind of mention like, well, she's in between things, and Colin is like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. So eventually, this Colin guy is to be really interested in Jen, and is to eventually just kind of be really nice to her, and is like, you know what, like, I'm gonna give you my card, and like, if anything, if you want to hang out or if you want to do anything, let me know. And so eventually we have Jen, who is talking to her friend after this party is over, um, because what had happened was Jen had gone off uh, to try and catch an Uber, and she ends up catching her ex boyfriend again instead. And so all of a sudden they end up having sex with one another, because I guess like one last breakup sex kind of thing. And so eventually the very next day, Jen is to get back with her friend, and tell her what had happened last night. And so like her friend is like, well, hey, like, are you two gonna get back together? And so the girl's like, no, I think that was just a one-time thing. So the girl's like, you know what, like, how about you go and you see that doctor, because like eventually he can like possibly help you in some kind of way, because if anything, I think right now like you really need therapy. And so Jen takes her friend up on this offer, and so she is to eventually end up going and talking to Colin. And so Colin is to eventually talk about how uh, like how feeding his fish can kind of help him be like a better person, weirdly. That it's kind of like a, like, I think he ends up saying like it's some kind of like soothing activity or something like that, or I don't know, it's some goofy kind of thing that he ends up saying about this feeding fish thing, which I thought was really interesting, but not interesting enough to memorize what he said. uh, but anyways, so it seems like everything that Colin is to do is to just try to get um, eventually Jen to just kind of like really like this guy more and more. So, anyways, so Colin is to figure out how to eventually come up into the conversation of this first session to eventually try and hypnotize Jen. So, I guess really Jen is to go on and bite her fingernails, so I guess he ends up using that against her. Just like, you know what? Like, how about I hypnotize you to eventually get you to subconsciously just eventually just stop doing certain kind of activities. And so the girl's like, you know what? That sounds like a nice thing. So he ends up hypnotizing her. She goes under, and eventually she wakes up. So Jen all of a sudden is to eventually, right after this session, evidently she's to get the job that she wanted. And so all of a sudden she is to end up also uh, going and calling her ex to eventually just say, like, oh, hey, how about you and me? How about you and me go and have dinner together and, like, see where that leads? Uh, and so I think Colin ends up bumping into uh, Jen, and is like, well, hey, like kind of like seeing how things are seemingly going for Jen, and Jen is like, well, hey, I just got really busy lately with our sessions because like I just got a new job. Uh, it seems that Jen is eventually going to eventually get back with this old flame of hers, and so Collins is like, well, like, hey, like, definitely, and like, yeah, this will all work out. So eventually, you should probably just go on and uh, and see where this kind of technical date between you and your ex is to eventually head. So all of a sudden, we end up having Jen, who is to have all of a sudden start to of lost time, and she ends up waking up with her husband now having this allergic reaction to whatever food she made, and her ex is to, I guess, be in a coma of sorts. So all of a sudden, Jen is to all of a sudden just be like, "Oh my god, what had happened here? Like I just blacked out. I just lost time." And so eventually, Jen is to go to her friend and just be like, "Hey, like I had been I had experienced a loss of time, and this doesn't quite make sense." And so all of a sudden, Jen is to research this and eventually realize that there had been certain hypnotic therapists that eventually had started to take advantage of people, and that Jen is thinking like, well, uh, like this girl had had this happen to her, and now I coincidentally had this happen to me. Like this does not seem right. So eventually, what happens is that uh, eventually these people are to go to the police about this to just be like, well, hey, like if like someone were to have uh, gone on and try to hypnotize us and like done something without us knowing, like what should we kind of do? And so like immediately they're just like, well, like you should never do another appointment with him immediately, and just kind of eventually kind of keep yourself safe. So eventually, instead, Jen is to eventually decide to go and do one more session, but she is to record this session to just kind of see uh, if reasonably uh, Colin will try to pull something. So eventually, Jen is to put together this session, and so Jen is to just kind of try to come up with some kind of reason for wanting to put this session together, and Colin realizes that. And so immediately, Colin is to eventually win after uh, Colin is to put Jen under. He immediately asks her, like, well, hey, why did you really put this session together? It's like, well, because I wanted to record you. I wanted to record this whole session. And so Colin is just like, okay, well, all right, well, does anybody know about this, like this thing besides you and me? And Jen is like, well, like my friend knows, and Colin is like, oh, okay, great. So eventually, Jen is to play this whole thing back, because eventually, what ends up happening is Jen's friend ends up getting a phone call, and so all of a sudden, Jen's friend is to answer this phone, and so eventually, Colin is like, "Well, hey, uh, like, are you eventually going to create another appointment with me?" And the girl is like, "Oh, not anytime soon. I'm just in the car with my boyfriend," and so uh, Colin is like, "Well, great, because like this is how your world ends." So all of a sudden, we have this girl who has like a spider who's crawling up her chest, and so she's like, "Oh my god, get it off!" And the boyfriend is like, "Well, what?" And she's like, "Oh my god, get it off!" And so all of a sudden, this girl is paying attention to absolutely nothing besides this spider that is to be on her chest, and so all of a sudden she ends up having her car get hit and goes into an accident, and so eventually now Jen is to realize that it's like, oh my god, like something's going down. So all of a sudden we end up having where seemingly Detective Wade Rollins is to eventually go to uh Dr. Colin and is to mention like, you know what? I'm starting to see a pattern here. Like, I'm a person that loves to solve puzzles and so on and so forth. And so Wade had started to figure out that the connection of these girls that had all um, died recently had been all Colin's patients, and they had all been hypnotized by Colin. And so eventually Wade is to start to look through certain things of certain like stuff that Colin had done to his patients, and it seems that the only hypnotized girls have been the ones that have died lately. So eventually we end up having it to where eventually Colin is to eventually ask Wade, it's like, well, hey, like, have you ever like wanted to get hypnotized? Like, it seems like you're having a problem with insomnia, so I can help you like clear that up. And so Wade is just like, oh no, like I'm not going to be booking any sessions with you anytime soon because it seems like I'm going to be sleeping another way. So all of a sudden, Wade is to go home and it's just kind of get his food ready and is to just kind of go and watch TV. To all of a sudden have, I guess, a hypnotized sleeper agent go and uh, come out of Wade's cupboards and eventually attack him. And then eventually now Wade is like rustling with this woman. And so he ends up having to forcibly kill her, and so Wade is just like, oh my god, like freaking like he ends up going to the hospital, and so eventually Jen is to eventually get connected with this Wade guy, and so eventually what ends up happening is that Colin is to eventually go and really just cement his control over Jen, where eventually he is to kind of come to her house and then eventually like tell her what to do, like to tell her to stop or to tell her to sleep or to tell her to whatever. Um, so that way, really, Colin just cements that he has real control over her. And so, like, we just have Jen who is just kind of frozen until like Colin is just kind of tell her everything. So let me pause here for 1 second. All right. So eventually, how this plays out is it seems that we have Detective Wade, who is to also have a hypnotist on his payroll of his police station. And so it seems that this hypnotist is to be able to uh, kind of eventually her way of doing things is that she can go and have people maybe subconsciously be able to figure out certain kind of license plates of certain kind of cars or something like that. So, like Detective Wade Rollins is to eventually tell Jen, it's like, well, maybe there's like something that this hypnotist can possibly pull from you of any number of these sessions to eventually maybe kind of be a step ahead of the game for whatever reason. So all of a sudden, Jen is to go ahead and do this, and so eventually, what ends up happening is while this hypnotist is to go and who is Dr. Stella Graham is to eventually hypnotize Jen. And all of a sudden, while Jen is being hypnotized, she is to eventually start to be seemingly choked, like as if she's drowning or if she's just being like choked for whatever reason. And so uh, eventually, Dr. Graham is to have to eventually get Jen from out of her hypnotized state. And so Jen all of a sudden is to pull something from out of this session. She ends up finding out that Colin had a certain other building that evidently he's to be kind of there at, and supposedly she is to go to this building by March 6th, which is coincidentally the day of uh, when this girl is to eventually go and get this weird, goofy bracelet. So we have Jen who is to go and decide to want to go to this building because it feels like she needs to go to this building anyways. So eventually, Jen is to go to this building to eventually find out that she was basically made to come to this building, and that this there was this doctor that Colin had talked about that had supposedly given him this building, but I think he probably was this former doctor. So, and maybe that he had gotten some plastic surgery and maybe changed his looks, who knows. But, anyways, so because this building is under a different name. So, eventually, what ends up playing out is that Colin was to have Jen here because eventually he was to realize that he wanted to go and find a woman that was just like his previous lover, and there had been some girls that kind of mimicked uh, what she had uh, been like in some way or another. But Jen was to eventually be able to have like talked like her, walked like her, and smelled like her. And so Colin is like, "Yep, you were the perfect match for me." And so while Colin was to eventually go and hypnotize Jen, he also gave this girl memories that she didn't have of some certain like time when supposedly Colin and her were together, but actually it was to be Colin and this previous lover that he had. So Colin is forcing memories now into Jen, and so eventually we also had Stella, who before she was to let or Dr. Graham, before Jen was to let Dr. uh, before Dr. Graham was to let Jen leave, she immediately was to tell her, it's like, well, hey, how about since I can't go into your mind and counter what this guy had done, maybe I can create some kind of counter for his counter. So eventually, Jen is to go off and is to eventually go and now having to forcibly uh, be at seemingly this location. All of a sudden, Wade is to eventually make his way to having somebody give him some information that is to force him to want to call Jen to just be like, hey, what's going on? And Jen is to mention that she is at this specific house and for uh, him to help her. And so eventually, Wade is to make it there with basically a ton of cops. And so come to find out that Jen isn't even in this location. She is still hypnotized. And then eventually, Colin is to wake her up at a completely different location. And so now eventually we end up having Wade who is to figure this out, and so eventually he ends up finding them, and he ends up going and uh, rustling with Colin, and so eventually Colin ends up seeing Jen, and so he's to put her to sleep supposedly, and so Jen is to immediately think that she is to have shot and killed uh, Colin, and that all this thing had been resolved, and so eventually we end up having Jen being re-woken up, and she's in the arms uh, of Wade, and so like he's weirdly just kind of like putting a blanket on her and just kind of like having her rest on his shoulders, and we end up realizing that this isn't actually Wade. It's to actually be, of course, uh, Colin instead. So all of a sudden the words "my love" coming in, and so that means that uh, that that triggers Jen to wake back up. So all of a sudden, we end up finding out that actually Jen had shot Wade, and so now when she is to find Wade, eventually she is to go and grab this gun and to try and kill Colin, in which that she ends up does uh, going ahead and killing Colin. And so in the end, we end up having, of course, after this whole case is to be wrapped, Wade is to get a promotion, and so eventually Jen is to just kind of like, well, hey, like I just wanted to like kind of like see you again, like as this case to all wrap up and just kind of make sure that everything is what it really is. So eventually, Wade is to give Jen one last gift before she is to go off. And so the last gift is that he ends up giving her a disc to where she is to go and fall asleep and listen to this disc and self hypnotize herself. And so Jen is like, ah ha 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 ha. So I've already been hypnotized quite enough, but like he's coming with this to just kind of self hypnotize me. Ha 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 ha. Like you're so funny. So eventually Jen is to walk off, and she ends up going and is at the bedside of her ex lover, and she's to mention that like whatever she's going to do to try to make this work, she's going to make it work. And so like that's just kind of how the movie for me really just kind of fizzles off. So with that said, I kind of in a roundabout way very covered this movie, but I really rushed through it a lot too. So I think that's all I wanted to say about this film. Like I might have not gotten this all perfectly, um, but I thought that this movie was interesting enough. I thought this movie was good enough. But I think I'm gonna good enoughly get out of here. Yeah. So, uh, trying to think if there's anything that I probably missed here. I don't think I really did. Uh, oh, we end up having also the whole reason why Jen's friend was to have gotten killed by uh, Colin was really just because Jen's friend was to confess to Jen that she had gotten hypnotized once before by Colin, and that maybe there's going to be at some point where Jen's friend is going to eventually get controlled by him, And so eventually, when Jen is to go to this session and say that her friend is to be the one that knows about this whole thing that's going on, Colin is to immediately try to thin the herd by basically going and killing Jen's friend, so that way Jen is the only one really left knowing all this. And so yeah, so hopefully I got most of this dialogue out. Um, but anyways, I think I'm gonna get out of here. I think I covered most of this movie, or most of the bullet points of this film. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.